As a governor, Basuki Cahayapurnama, or better known by his Chinese nickname Ahok, has been widely hailed as a straight-talking politician with a strong anti-corruption stance. But he has created a furore recently when he warned voters not to be fooled by a Quranic verse that prevented Muslims from choosing a non-Muslim leader. The remarks had triggered furious protests among certain segments of the Indonesian society who accused him of committing blasphemy against Islam. The police have also named him as a suspect in the blasphemy allegation, which means that he could be tried in an open court. Is this the end of the road for the Jakarta governor?
November 4, 2016, the day when tensions flared in Indonesia's capital, Jakarta. Hundreds of thousands of people descended onto the streets to protest against the leadership of Jakarta's governor, Basuki Cahayapurnama, or better known by his Chinese nickname, Ahok. Mr. Basuki is also the front-runner in the February 2017 gubernatorial election, backed by President Jokowi's party, the PDIP. He'll be running against former Education Minister, Mr. Anies Baswedan, who's supported by the Gerindra party, or former General Prabowo Subianto, and Mr. Agus Yudhoyono, son of the former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono. The controversy was centered on a comment he made to a group of fishermen in September. There, he called on Muslims not to be deceived by a Quranic verse that prohibited Muslims from electing non-Muslims as their leaders. For those who know him well, the remark by the often blunt-speaking governor seemed harmless. But to hardline Muslims, it came across as an insult to the Holy Book and accused him of blasphemy, which is a criminal offense in Indonesia. The question is, did he or did he not cross the line and commit the act of blasphemy? The police certainly think so when they named him a suspect in the blasphemy investigations.
Anybody who has followed his career, followed his policies, his mannerisms in public as governor and as a politician generally, you would know that he's a very sharp-tongued person. Sometimes he's not very careful with what he says. Many Jakartans certainly find that an endearing factor, but it has landed him in trouble a few times, including this one.
The problem with him was the way he delivered his ideas, and I think this is something that Muslims are not ready to accept. I think this has always been a problem for Ahok, who wants to portray himself as a strong man, a man who can change Jakarta. But in terms of the way he communicates with society, I think this is an area in which he has to improve. What Ahok would have done is actually not to get involved in the debates, the theological debates. What he could have said is that he could have quoted Muslim scholars in Indonesia who would have shared his view.
But many analysts agree that Ahok has done a remarkable job as the city's governor after he inherited the position from his predecessor, Joko Widodo, in 2014. His efforts to fast-track infrastructure projects and address the city's notorious problems like flooding and traffic congestion have made him extremely popular among the middle-class community and liberal Muslims.
One of the most obvious things is the flooding. So that is kind of a seasonal that happens frequently in Jakarta. So after seeing how he became the governor, I think the frequency of flooding becomes less and less. He cleaned up all the rivers, okay, and then also he built these retainer walls, so that protecting all the houses near the rivers from flooding and things like that. Improving public transport, so by providing more buses, and then by pushing forward towards the completions of the MRT lines, the subway lines.
He was, and I would argue still is, seen as a maverick figure, a governor who has the guts to get things done in Jakarta. Anyone who's been to Jakarta can understand that there are crippling problems with the city, to do with the traffic, to do with poverty, to do with annual floodings where the city would come to a complete standstill. Jakartans are sick of this. And first of all, Jokowi and then Ahok as his successor represent hope that something can be done about this.
But while he has gained praise for his efficient leadership, he was also loathed by the city's urban poor, many of whom were forced to relocate to make way for development.
Ahok has also alienated many Jakartans, particularly the urban poor, who has suffered under his harsh regime, particularly to do with swift evictions of slum areas around the riverbanks. I think the Jakarta Legal Aid Foundation found that there are at least 16,000 families that have been forcibly evicted from their homes, and only about 30% of them have been properly relocated as well.
President Joko Widodo has suggested that some political actors were to be blamed for stoking tensions at the mass rally. The statement by former President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono urging the government to respect the rule of law by hauling Ahok to court had invited suspicions that he might have played a role in the protests. But is there any real basis behind the suspicion?
We don't really see concrete proof yet. Just before the protest, there was a press release and statement made by the former president, SBY, and things like that. So the timing is very, it's interesting here. It's so coincidence towards the big protest on in that event.
The big political parties, in my opinion, didn't do enough to quell the kind of hateful speech, the racist remarks, the xenophobic remarks that were made at that time. And if they can be faulted for something, it would be that. To point the finger of blame to Prabowo or to SBY or masterminding or being behind anything would be unsubstantiated at this point.
The organizer of the protest was a hardline Islamist group called the Islamic Defenders Front, or FPR. The radical militant organization, infamous for hate crimes and violence in Indonesia, had a record of harassing, threatening and attacking religious minorities like Christians and Shia Muslims. It's also bent on ousting Ahok to fulfill its religious agenda that only Muslims should lead Muslim-majority Indonesia.
They have always been seen as a radical group, while the FBI have not been making much headway in Indonesian Islam because they've always been attacked by the liberals and the progressive. I think they saw the Ahok incident as an opportunity for them to become more prominent in the public sphere.
The police have arrested dozens of people in the aftermath of the November 4th protests, and by naming Ahok a suspect means that he could be tried in an open court.
Baik kami menghimbau kepada seluruh pendukung untuk menerima status berkata saya dengan ikhlas. Karena kita yakin polisi kita pasti profesional menetapkan ini sebagai tersangka. Ya kita juga ingatkan kepada pendukung, ini bukan akhir, kita kan ada proses pengadilan yang kita lakukan dengan terbuka.
But as the dust settles on the streets of Jakarta, the protests left a few critical questions hanging in the air. Has Indonesia's secular identity been hijacked by the extremist forces in the country? And is there a place for non-Muslim political leaders in the country's future power structure? Indonesia, home to the world's largest Muslim population, has a long tradition of pluralism and religious tolerance. It's widely respected around the world for its successful transition from authoritarian rule under former strongman Suharto to well-functioning democracy under a civilian government. But its initial transition towards democracy was not without problems. It was marred by occasional violence against the minority, including the Chinese community, during the massive economic meltdown in 1998. The protesters have directed their resentment towards the Chinese, who are often perceived to wield economic clout beyond their numbers. Fast forward almost 2 decades later, the racist overtones resurface at the November 4th protests. It has invoked memories of that bitter episode that triggered the fall of President Suharto. Only this time, the role of some hardline Islamists has become more pronounced.
I think this protest will be dangerous if it's hijacked by extremist groups. If we recall, during the protest itself, it was generally peaceful in the early stages of the protests. It's amazing because a few days before the protest, Jokowi actually spoke to community leaders, Islamic groups, and they have come up very clearly that we are not against the protests. In fact, this is part of a democratic culture to express their feelings, but all community leaders agree that they should not engage in violence. So it was during the later part of the protest that it turned out to be violent.
Time and again, race and religion have proven to become the convenient rallying point for the extremist forces to gain ground in Indonesia. President Jokowi, on the other hand, avoided any criticism of the hardliners.
His positions is kind of tricky. So everybody knows that he is close to Ahok. He was the governor and Ahok was the vice governor. So they have a good relationship with each other, so they can coordinate, they can cooperate well. So and that remains even after Jokowi becomes president. So when that thing happens, this kind of put Jokowi as the president in the spotlight.
None of the governments has been brave enough to alienate any member of society, particularly from the Muslim voters. They don't want to appear too favorable towards non-Muslims, for instance. And what the government needs to realize that this is about citizens' rights. This is about civil society. This is not just about not wanting to alienate particular groups in society or not alienating particular voters. So in the future, I think the Jokowi government needs to be much stronger about this issue, particularly in response to vigilante Muslim groups such as the Islamic Defenders Front.
I have more faith in Indonesians because when we talk about extremist groups, they've always been there in Indonesia, but there are pockets in different parts of the country. We talk about the terrorist threat. It's not a recent phenomenon. This ISIS threat is basically another form of extremism. In the past, we have the Jemaah Islamiyah, we have the Darul Islam movement. So extremism has always been there in Indonesia. But I have more faith. I think Indonesia has a self-checking mechanism against extremism.
But the recent protests reveals a growing discomfort among the more religious segments of the population towards the Jakarta governor. And it appears that Ahok is now sitting on the dangerous religious fault line that may pull different societies apart. Is there really a place for non-Muslim leaders in a Muslim-dominated country like Indonesia?
We have seen so many improvements. Chinese-Indonesian discrimination has largely been abolished. Now we see Chinese-Indonesians in positions of power, in positions of government, not just in the figure of Ahok, but also in politics generally. At the moment, there are at least 15 ethnic Chinese members of parliament. And that's significant, considering that during this New Order era, there were hardly any. And now we also see Chinese cultures being publicly celebrated. Now Chinese New Year is a national holiday. And now more and more schools are offering Mandarin as a course of study, for instance. So I think it would be very unfair to say that Indonesia hasn't moved on from its dark anti-Chinese past.
The problem is in Ahok's case because of because of Ahok, and he is a leading figure there. He close to our President Jokowi. He is considered actually successfully as leading Jakarta as a governor. So that he is a Chinese descendant, he is a Christian, yeah. Maybe some group using this for getting advantage in the local election, yeah, for Jakarta government election. He has right, yeah, for running election. But the problem is, once he is found guilty, the problem is he will be replaced by his deputy. So, I mean, his report will be useless.
So now, Ahok's controversy will be a test of the maturity of Indonesia's democracy. The polls suggest that he'll be hard to beat at the upcoming gubernatorial election on account of his no-nonsense efficiency and tough stance on corruption. But after he's been named a suspect in the blasphemy allegation, the road ahead for him may be less certain.